In the first half of the 1950s, having a job was still the simplest way to belong somewhere. In the Rust Belt, that idea didn't come from speeches or posters on office walls. It came from repetition, from the noise that woke the town before sunrise, from the metallic smell that never fully left your clothes, from the fact that, as long as the plant stayed open and the shifts stayed full, life felt like it had a direction. Towns were built around work. There wasn't much distance between where people lived and where they made a living. Houses sat close enough to the plant that nobody could pretend it didn't shape everything. Steel dust settled on windowsill. Laundry hung out back, came in darker than it went out. Nobody talked much about it. That was part of the deal. After the war, people had learned to value steadiness. The hard years were still too close to forget, and that made stability feel like something earned, almost fragile. A steady job meant more than a paycheck. It meant the ground wouldn't shift under your feet that week. The plant whistle kept time better than any clock. When it blew, men were already up, pulling on clothes, drinking coffee too hot from chipped mugs. The streets were still dark, but there was enough movement that nobody felt alone walking to work. The factory sat near the river, like so many others. Big, heavy, built to outlast the men who passed through it. The walls still carried marks from wartime expansions, back when producing more wasn't just business. It was duty. In the 50s, the urgency had eased, but the pace stayed. Inside, the heat never really left. Even in winter, your body adjusted fast. The noise was constant, but not chaotic. There was order in it, a rhythm you learned well enough that your hands moved without needing thought. It wasn't a place that forgave carelessness. One piece out of place, one adjustment done wrong, a second too fast or too slow. Those things didn't always show up right away. They waited. That's why there was respect on the floor. Not a romantic kind of respect. A practical one, the kind that comes from knowing mistakes collect their price later. The most important rules weren't written down anywhere. You learned them by watching the older men. You learned them by keeping quiet. You learned them by knowing not every question needed to be asked out loud. Walter Hayes had worked there long enough to know that code without ever hearing it explained. He'd hired on in the late 40s, not long after coming back from military service. There wasn't much choice then. The war was over, but everything was still settling. If you found steady work, you took it. You didn't argue much about the terms. Walter took it. He started where most men did. Heavy work, repetitive work, more watching than deciding. He didn't mind. He'd always believed you had to understand a place before you could run anything in it. He spent months just learning the rhythm. When to speak, when to just do the job. Over time, more responsibility came his way. Nothing sudden, nothing announced, just more tasks, more trust handed over quietly. Before he realized it, he was in a spot where a mistake wouldn't just slow his own shift. It would affect a lot of men down the line. He took that seriously, not out of fear, out of conviction. Walter wasn't a man for speeches, never had been. He believed good work didn't need explaining. You could see it in the result, not in the words used to dress it up. His father used to say the only thing a man truly owned was his name. Walter grew up hearing that like it was just a fact. At the plant, that idea took on a different shape. His name wasn't posted anywhere, but it was there all the same, carried in every piece that left his station. He believed loyalty was part of the job, not blind loyalty, practical loyalty, showing up every day, not making trouble where there didn't need to be any, trusting that the men above him were looking at the whole picture, not just numbers. In the 1950s, that belief didn't seem foolish. The plant was growing steady. Orders came in regular. There was talk of expansion, new hires, updating machines, no rumors of shutdowns. No sense that the bottom was about to drop out. In the break room, talk stayed grounded. Buying a better house, trading in the car, putting something away for the kids. Nobody was celebrating, but there was confidence. A feeling that if you did your part, Life would keep moving forward without surprises. Walter never thought much past the next shift. That wasn't lack of ambition. It was control. The world had already taught him that long plans didn't always survive reality. He preferred steadiness. On the floor, that showed in how he carried himself. Walter didn't argue decisions in the middle of production. If something came down from above, he adjusted. If a supervisor asked for something different, he did it, as long as it wasn't plainly wrong. He believed questioning everything weakened the whole operation. That made him dependable. He wasn't the fastest. He wasn't the loudest. He wasn't the most liked, but he was someone you could count on. If something needed doing quietly, Walter did it. If a shift ran short, he stayed. If a small problem popped up, he handled it without spreading it around. He didn't see that as sacrifice. He saw it as his part of the unspoken agreement that kept things running. At home, that same logic held. Life followed a pattern. Bills got paid. Meals came on time. Work didn't spill onto the table as complaints. The tiredness stayed in his body, not his mouth. Walter believed that kind of loyalty, quiet, steady, not asking for immediate return, was exactly what held things together. It might not bring recognition, but it brought security. And at that point in his life, security felt like enough. In the middle of the 1950s, there was no sign that this way of moving through the world would become a problem. Loyalty still felt simple, almost natural, something you practiced without keeping score. Walter had no reason to imagine that later on, this same way of living would start demanding choices that no longer fit inside that calm logic. For now, everything worked, and as long as everything worked, there was no reason to change a thing. Block 2, English, Final Narrative Translation, 1950s, Rust Belt, Factory Worker Theme, Deepening, Loyalty as a Daily Habit, Learned Without Words. As the months went by, Walter Hayes started to understand something that wasn't written down anywhere. The factory didn't run just because of machines. It ran because certain men showed up every day, stood in the same spots, made the same motions, and didn't disappear when something slipped a little off plan. That was the real balance, not the kind you could measure, but the kind that kept the whole place from shaking when things weren't perfect. Walter was one of those men. He never thought of himself that way. He would have laughed at the idea. To him, he was just doing the job the way it was meant to be done. But over time, he noticed that the same kinds of situations kept finding their way to the same handful of people. The ones who didn't complain. The ones who didn't argue. The ones who didn't turn every small problem into a meeting. The days still started the same. The whistle cutting through the dark. Coffee swallowed too fast. The familiar walk past the gate with other men who didn't need to talk much to know where they were headed. But inside the plant, small things began to shift. A supervisor walked the floor earlier than usual. Someone mentioned a bigger order under their breath. A machine got adjusted quicker than normal, followed by a quiet, "We'll square it up later." Walter heard those things. He always did. He just didn't react right away. Not because he missed the warning signs, but because reacting too soon in a place like that often made things worse. There were still plenty of shifts where nothing out of the ordinary happened. The line ran steady. Everyone stayed in rhythm. Those were good days. Not easy days, just clean ones. Days that didn't ask him to make judgment calls. Then there were other days. A man showed up late. Not enough to make a scene, but enough to matter. The supervisor wasn't around yet. Somebody had to cover that station until things settled. Walter stepped in without a word. Not because they were friends, because the line couldn't stop. Another time, a part came through just a touch off. Not bad enough to scrap, not clean enough to pass without notice. It could be corrected further down. Writing it up would slow everything. Walter kept it moving. That didn't feel like cutting corners. It felt like keeping things alive. Those moments never came as direct orders. Nobody ever said, Do this. They came as expectation. The kind of expectation that men who'd been around a while understood without having to spell it out. Walter considered himself that kind of man. He didn't think of these decisions as giving something up. He thought of them as maintenance, like oiling a machine before it seized. The plant had to run, deadlines had to be met, and outside those walls, families depended on the place staying open. To Walter, loyalty wasn't a word you used in speeches. It was something you practiced. It meant not creating trouble when there didn't need to be any. It meant fixing what could be fixed on your own shift. It meant protecting the whole from small cracks before they turned into breaks. Nobody ever thanked him for that, but nobody told him to stop either. Over time, people began to rely on him in quiet ways, not in a heroic sense, in a practical one. If something drifted a little off course, Walter would deal with it. If a problem could be handled without spreading it around, it usually landed in his lap. Supervisors liked that, not because they wanted to hide things. At least not how they saw it. They trusted Walter to know the difference between something that truly mattered and something that just needed smoothing over. That trust started to change his days. He got pulled aside more often, asked to take a look at things that needed quick handling, a fix made without much talk, a note filled out later, if at all, a shift that needed to end on time, no matter what it took, and Walter always said yes. He didn't weigh it. He didn't count it. He just did it. At home, those changes barely showed on the surface. He still came in around the same time, still sat down to dinner with the same quiet tiredness in his shoulders. But some nights, he spoke less than usual. Not upset, just thinking. His wife noticed, of course. She always did. But she didn't push. She knew work was something Walter carried around in his head before he ever let it come out of his mouth. Walter never stopped to ask himself how far this willingness might go. He didn't need to. Up to that point, everything still felt reasonable. Every small adjustment came with the sense that he was doing what needed doing, what a steady man was supposed to do. And, just as important, nothing bad had happened because of it. The plant kept running. The checks kept coming. The trust seemed solid. Walter believed loyalty worked both ways, even if the balance wasn't perfect all the time. He understood that a company couldn't always give back right away, but he believed that, over the long haul, things evened out. In the world he knew, steadiness counted for something. At that point in the 1950s, he still believed the world rewarded men who showed up, kept their heads down, and didn't walk away when things got uncomfortable. Maybe not with praise, maybe not with thanks, but with continuity. And for a man like Walter Hayes, continuity meant everything. He couldn't see yet that by becoming the man who quietly fixed what wasn't supposed to become a problem, he was also making himself easier to overlook when the time came to settle accounts. That realization would come later. For now, the days kept moving forward, one shift at a time, and loyalty still felt like something simple, almost natural, just the way things were done. Block 3, English, final narrative translation. 1950s, Rust Belt, factory worker, theme in progression, when loyalty starts to carry weight. Over time, Walter Hayes began to feel that the factory was no longer asking just for his labor. It was asking for his presence. Not physical presence. He'd always given that. This was something harder to name, a kind of constant availability, like it was expected that he'd always be ready to catch whatever slipped, even when it wasn't part of his shift on paper. The days were still similar, but they weren't identical anymore. There were weeks when everything stayed inside the lines. Production steady, few hiccups, short conversation. On those weeks, Walter felt like he was still inside the old agreement. You did the work, you carried the responsibility that came with it, and that was that. Then there were other weeks when requests came wrapped in loose language. Just for today. We'll clean it up later. No need to write that up yet. Walter listened closely to those phrases, not because they were new, but because they were showing up too often to be brushed off as exceptions. He told himself this was just how adult life worked. You didn't get clean choices every time. There was pressure to keep things moving, commitments made higher up that never reached the floor in full detail, things he wasn't meant to see from where he stood. Still, something inside him had started to shift. One day, a younger operator asked Walter to double-check a full batch that had already passed basic inspection. Nothing was obviously wrong, but the kid looked unsure. Walter could have said no. It wasn't his assignment, that shift. But he knew that if something was off, it wouldn't show up until much later, and then it would land hard on someone, so he checked it. It took longer than expected. He corrected small things, compensated where he could. The batch moved on. At the end of the day, nobody said anything. No thanks, no questions. Walter walked out, feeling like he'd worked the same shift twice. Another time, a supervisor asked him to cover a report that should have come from a different department. There wasn't time to send it up the chain. It was easier to handle it on the floor. Walter hesitated for a few seconds. Not because it was wrong, but because it didn't feel entirely right anymore. Still, he did it. He started noticing that these requests almost never came with paperwork. No form, no note. Just the understanding that Walter would take care of it. That understanding, which used to feel like trust, was starting to feel like something else. He was the one called when something didn't need to become an issue, the one expected to smooth things out quietly, the one people relied on not to ask too many questions. Walter didn't like thinking about it that way, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was getting closer to the truth. In the break room, he noticed small changes. Conversation stopped when he sat down, not out of suspicion, out of caution. Some men seemed to keep their distance, like standing too close to Walter might pull them into responsibilities they didn't want. Others leaned in more than before. You know this stuff better than I do. You get how this place works. You can be trusted. Walter heard those words with a quiet discomfort. He didn't want to be above anyone, but he didn't want to be the catch-all for things nobody wanted to touch officially either. He didn't say that out loud. He still believed loyalty meant holding things together when they threatened to come apart, even if it meant uneven effort, even if it meant swallowing small discomforts to avoid bigger problems. But that effort was starting to leave marks. Some nights, when he got home, he sat in the car a little longer before going inside. Engine off, hands on the wheel. Just a few extra seconds to separate the man he'd been at work from the man he needed to be at home. His wife noticed before he fully admitted it to himself. "You're carrying too much from work," she said one evening. Not accusing, just stating it. Walter shrugged. It's a phase. He believed that when he said it, but deep down, he was starting to see that this phase didn't have edges. No clear end. No sign it would stop expanding, just more and more being expected of him. At the plant, that expansion showed up in subtle ways. Walter started getting pulled into decisions without being given real authority. He was asked for input, but not backing. Consulted, but not protected. If something went wrong, the weight could fall on him. If it went right, the credit disappeared into the system. He was seeing that clearly now. One morning, after handling a messy situation between two departments, a supervisor said, almost casually, "Good thing you're loyal to the place." It was meant as praise, but something tightened in Walter's chest. Loyal to the place. He turned the words over in his head. Loyal to what, exactly? The company? The people? The operation? Or the idea that someone always had to carry the weight so others didn't have to? He didn't answer, just nodded. From that point on, he started paying closer attention to the cost of the choices he'd been making. He noticed that whenever something required a hard call, the easiest solution was to hand it to him. Not out of malice, but out of habit. Walter was predictable. He'd do the right thing. He wouldn't stir trouble. He wouldn't send problems upstairs unless he had to. That predictability, which used to feel like a strength, was turning into a trap. He didn't call it exploitation. That word felt too big, too dramatic. Nobody was openly taking advantage of him. There were no threats, no raised voices. There was expectation, and expectation, left unchallenged, turns into obligation. Walter felt it on days when he caught himself planning around problems that weren't officially his yet, running scenarios in his head, fixing things mentally before anyone had even asked. That kind of thinking followed him home. Sleep came slower, not from sharp anxiety, but from a constant state of alertness. Like he was always halfway through a shift, even in his own bed. Still, he didn't see himself as wronged. He saw himself as someone trying to hold together something that had taken years to build. The plant, the routine, the sense of stability, all of it felt too fragile to risk over personal discomfort. Walter still believed loyalty would be recognized eventually, maybe not with words, but with protection, when things finally got hard. What he didn't yet see was that the hard part had already started. The moment loyalty stopped being a choice and became an assumption. From there on, every new concession wouldn't be remembered as a favor. It would be treated as a given. Block 4, English, final narrative translation, 1950s, Rust Belt, factory worker theme moving forward. When loyalty starts to show a visible cost. Walter Hayes knew something had shifted the day he was asked to talk away from the floor. It wasn't formal. Nobody told him to report to an office. The supervisor just stepped close during a short lull, set his name low, and tipped his head toward a quieter corner. That small break from routine was enough to tighten Walter's stomach. Important conversations, he'd learned, didn't happen near the machines. They stopped by a stretch of floor near the supply room. Not an office, not private exactly. Just far enough that no one would hear by accident. The supervisor spoke first. "We've been leaning on you a lot." It wasn't praise, just a statement. Walter nodded. "You know how things run here," the man went on. "Not everything needs to turn into paperwork. Not everything needs to go upstairs." Walter listened without interrupting. He'd heard versions of this before. "There's a situation," the supervisor said. "Nothing serious, but it needs somebody watching it closer." He explained it loosely, a section that kept drifting just enough to matter. Nothing worth triggering inspections, nothing that justified management attention, but enough to cause delays if it wasn't handled carefully. "We want you to take responsibility for keeping an eye on it," the supervisor finished. Walter understood right away what that meant. It wasn't a promotion. It wasn't official. There was no raise, no title, just responsibility. He asked one question: "For how long?" The supervisor shrugged. "Until it settles down." Those words stuck with Walter. Until it settles down. In his experience, things like that rarely settled on their own. He agreed, like he usually did, not because he felt good about it, but because saying no would have required more explaining than he had words for, and he didn't know how to explain a feeling without sounding difficult. Over the next few days, that new responsibility took real space in his shift. Walter had to move around more, watch processes that weren't his, talk to men who didn't technically answer to him. He did it carefully. He didn't want to sound like a foreman. He didn't want to stir resistance. He spoke like a co-worker, not a boss. Suggestions instead of orders, quiet reminders instead of corrections. At first, it worked. The small issues smoothed out. Delays shortened. The section ran cleaner. Nobody commented. Nobody thanked him. Walter realized he was now spending more time handling other people's problems than tending his own station. That meant trusting others to keep his area steady while he was gone, a trade he hadn't asked for, but was now living with. He came home more drained than before. Not physically, mentally, the kind of tiredness that didn't go away with a short rest. His wife noticed. "You're working twice as hard," she said one night. Walter gave a small smile. "It's temporary." He still believed that when he said it. Inside the plant, the new arrangement settled in faster than he expected. Whenever something went sideways in that section, Walter's name came up naturally. Talk to Hayes. Walter's watching that. He's handling it. Before long, that expectation spread past what had been discussed. If something went wrong nearby, even if it wasn't directly tied to that area, eyes still drifted toward him. Not accusing, expectant. Walter felt it in the way people spoke. They didn't ask for his opinion. They asked for solutions. They didn't check if he could handle it. They assumed he would. That change brought a consequence he hadn't seen coming. When things went right, nobody remembered who'd kept them that way. When something slipped, even slightly, the weight landed on him. One morning, a small delay caught the attention of the office. Nothing serious. Just a note on a report. The supervisor called Walter over. "We need to be more careful," he said. Controlled, measured. Walter felt a flicker of surprise. "I did what I could," he replied, careful but firm. "I know," the supervisor said, "but now it's on the radar." Walter understood. The responsibility had moved up a level. The protection hadn't. He began to see how narrow his position really was. He had no authority to force changes, no backing to impose decisions, but he carried enough responsibility to be tied to the outcome. It was a tight spot, and a slippery one. Still, Walter kept doing what he'd always done, adjusting, smoothing, keeping things from turning into problems. He told himself it was part of the process, that once things stabilized, everything would go back to normal. But normal was already shifting. Over the following weeks, he noticed his own station was being treated as steady enough to leave alone. Other operators filled in for tasks that had once been his. The explanation was always the same. Walter was needed elsewhere. He hadn't asked for that. He hadn't refused it, either. That shift began to affect how people saw him. Some men kept their distance, like he'd crossed an invisible line. Others leaned on him harder, looking for cover or guidance. Walter felt stuck between roles. He wasn't management, but he wasn't just one of the operators anymore. He lived in a space that didn't have a name. That space started to weigh on him. There came a day when the change became impossible to ignore. An operator made a clear mistake. Nothing disastrous, but enough to cause rework. The supervisor looked at Walter before saying a word. "That can't happen again." The words weren't aimed at the operator. They were aimed at him. Walter felt that familiar tightening in his stomach. Stronger this time. He understood then that something had crossed over. Not on paper, not officially, but in practice. He was now responsible for things he couldn't fully control. And there was no end date. That night at home, he took longer than usual to take off his boots, sat at the table without much appetite, pushing food around without noticing. His wife watched him quietly. "Still temporary?" she asked gently. Walter opened his mouth to answer and stopped. For the first time, he didn't know. He began to see that the loyalty he'd practiced for years, steady, quiet, unquestioned, had built an expectation that was hard to undo. He had become too useful to ignore and too exposed to be protected. Nothing terrible had happened yet, but something essential had shifted, and even if he wanted to, Walter no longer knew how to step back into the place he'd occupied before. After that conversation near the supply room, Walter Hayes's days began to take on a different shape. Even though nothing had been announced out loud, he still showed up at the same hour, walked through the same gate, pulled on the same coveralls. The whistle sounded like it always had. The machines made the same noise. To anyone watching from the outside, nothing had changed. But inside the shift, the order of things was no longer clear. Walter no longer started his day thinking only about his own station. Before he even switched on his machine, his mind ran through the rest of the floor. Who was working where? Who had been late recently? Which machines had been acting up? It wasn't something he was told to do. It was something that had become necessary. Whenever a delay cropped up, someone drifted over with half a sentence, a loose detail. Line 2's hanging up again. The guys in the back are struggling. The office wants eyes on this. Walter listened, asked a question or two, then moved. Sometimes he fixed the problem clean. Other times he adjusted just enough to keep the shift moving. The measure of success was simple now. Keep it from turning into an issue. It didn't matter if a problem was solved the right way. It mattered that it didn't travel, and Walter was good at that. He was careful not to give direct orders. He spoke as a co-worker, not a boss. Suggestions instead of command. He knew that authority without paperwork bred resentment. Still, people started treating him like he had authority. They waited for his word before acting, held off on decisions until he showed up, sometimes left things unresolved, trusting he would step in. Walter felt the weight of that most when things went wrong. A small delay, the kind that used to get absorbed, now carried his shadow, not because anyone blamed him openly, but because the logic had changed. If he was there to make sure nothing went wrong, then anything that did go wrong felt like a failure of the role. That logic started appearing in reports. Nothing direct, just lines like needs closer oversight or requires additional attention. Walter knew how to read between those words. He also knew those notes never came with the authorities to fix what needed fixing. He could suggest, he could warn, he could patch things temporarily, but structural decisions were still made above him. That imbalance began to bother him, not because it felt unfair in a dramatic way, but because it placed him in a position where responsibility outweighed voice. As the weeks went on, Walter's role settled into place. New requests came with an easy familiarity that made his stomach tighten. Can you take a look at this too? Since you're already there, I feel better if you handle it. Those phrases were always spoken politely. None of them sounded abusive on their own. The trouble was how often they came. Walter noticed that people no longer asked if he could. They assumed he could and would. At home, the shift began to show more clearly. He got back later, even without official overtime. His mind stayed at the plant during dinner. Sometimes he answered his wife a beat too late, like he was listening from another room. "You don't ever shut it off anymore," she said one night, not accusing. Walter tried to smile. It's just until things settle. But the word settle had lost its meaning. He began thinking back to how the job had been before the conversation by the supply room, before he became the guy for this, before he was pulled into everything that couldn't be allowed to turn into a problem. He missed the clarity, knowing exactly what he was responsible for, and just as important, what he wasn't. That clarity was gone. One incident made it plain. An operator made a bad call during an adjustment. Nothing disastrous, but enough to cause rework and slow the shift. The supervisor called Walter afterward, not the operator. "We need to tighten this up," the supervisor said. Walter listened. "You were overseeing it." The man continued. "We can't let that happen." Walter understood then that it didn't matter whether he'd given the right instruction or not. The fact that he was overseeing meant the responsibility was his. He tried to explain. "I wasn't there when it happened." The supervisor nodded, but the conversation had already moved past that point. "Still," he said. That word followed Walter the rest of the day. Still, it closed the door on any explanation. From that moment on, Walter felt something he'd never felt at the plant before. The loss of solid ground. Not panic, not fear. Displacement. He no longer knew where his role ended and others began. That kind of uncertainty, he knew, rarely favored the man caught in the middle. Some co-workers started keeping their distance, not hostile, just careful. Others leaned in harder, looking for protection or approval. Walter felt trapped between two places. No longer just an operator, not truly management. He existed in a narrow space without a name. That space began to close. When something needed to be said firmly, he hesitated, knowing he didn't have formal backing. When something needed to go up the chain, he held it, remembering the unspoken agreement that had put him there in the first place. Every decision required calculation, and every calculation took something out of him. Walter began to realize that the loyalty which had brought him this far was now being used as proof that he belonged there permanently. Nobody needed to say, "You've always done this." His history said it for them. It was like his past had turned into an open-ended contract, renewed automatically, without discussion. For the first time, Walter started asking himself what would happen if he said no, not out loud, just in his head. The answer never came clearly. There were no threats, no warnings, just the sense that refusing would break something that couldn't be rebuilt. Walter didn't like that feeling. He'd always believed loyalty was a choice, that it mattered because it was given freely. Now it was starting to feel like obligation, without limits. At this point, he still didn't act differently. He kept adjusting, covering, absorbing. But the way he did it had changed. It no longer came from calm conviction. It came from the fear of letting something fall that everyone expected him to hold. That difference, invisible on the surface, had settled deep enough that it couldn't be ignored anymore. Walter wasn't in crisis yet, but he was no longer whole. And without realizing it, he was spending the most valuable thing he had ever built at that place, the ability to decide how far his loyalty would go. Walter Hayes had always believed that loyalty and fairness walked together, not as big ideas, but as everyday practice. Doing right meant keeping your word, watching out for the men beside you, not passing problems down the line knowing someone else would pay for them later. For years, those things had never pulled apart inside him. Now they were starting to. The first sign came from something too small to make a formal issue, but too heavy to ignore. A younger operator, one Walter had been helping along for months, made a clear mistake during an adjustment. It wasn't carelessness, it was pressure. He tried to make up lost time by shortening a step that was never meant to be shortened. The mistake showed up quickly. There was rework, lost time, quiet looks passed between men. Nothing serious on paper, but this time, Walter noticed something different in how it was handled. The supervisor called both of them over. He spoke calmly, no raised voice, said it couldn't happen again. Then he looked at Walter, not the kid, and let the silence do the rest. The operator walked away, relieved. Walter stayed behind. Later, the supervisor spoke to him again, out of earshot of the others. "You know we can't let things like that slide," the man said. Walter nodded. "I know. He's still learning," the supervisor added. "We've got to hold these cases." That word landed wrong. Hold. Walter understood what was being asked. Don't write it up. Don't let it travel. Deal with it quietly, like so many times before. But this time, something didn't sit right. Not because the operator deserved to be punished. Walter had no interest in that, but because the mistake had come straight out of pressure from above, pressure nobody wanted to own. If this got absorbed like the others, the message was clear. The men on the floor carried the risk, while the structure stayed untouched. Walter nodded, but didn't answer right away. That night at home, the scene kept replaying in his head. After dinner, he sat at the table, shuffling through old papers without really seeing them. His wife noticed. "Something different happened today?" she asked, not pushing. Walter thought for a moment. "The same thing," he said. "Just not the same way." He didn't explain. He didn't know how to put it into words without making it sound bigger than it was. But inside, he knew he'd brushed up against a line. Over the next few days, the same situation showed up in different forms. A small error in another section, a rushed call that led to rework. Each time the pattern was the same. Fix it fast. Don't write it up. Protect the flow. And each time, the final look came to Walter. He began to feel like he was being asked to choose who took the hit and who stayed clean. without ever being formally put in that position. That bothered him more than he expected. Walter had always believed fairness meant proportion. If you made the call, you owned the outcome. If you pushed, you carried the weight. If you decided, you answered for it. Now it felt like the system had found an easier way to run, by shifting the load onto the men least likely to make noise. For someone like Walter, that was dangerous, not because it put him at risk right away, but because it asked him to act against the way he understood himself. He took pride in being reliable, but he didn't want to become quietly complicit in something he knew wasn't right. One morning he caught himself hesitating over a simple decision, whether to log a small deviation, nothing that would stop production, nothing dramatic. Before, the answer would have come without thinking. This time, it didn't. He stood there a few seconds longer, staring at the form. He thought through what would happen either way, who it would affect, what pattern it would reinforce. In the end, he filled it out. No announcement, no speech, just facts, written clean. The response came quicker than he expected. That same day, the supervisor called him over. "Did that really need to go up?" the man asked. The question wasn't sharp, but it carried weight. Walter answered carefully. "That's what happened." The supervisor let out a slow breath. "You know that makes things harder." Walter nodded. "I know," he said. But it felt like the right thing. There was an uncomfortable pause. The supervisor didn't argue. He didn't agree, either. He ended the conversation with a short nod and walked away. From that day on, Walter felt a shift in the air. Nothing was said, nothing was announced. But he was asked less often to take a look. Some decisions were made without him. Adjustments happened out of his reach. It was subtle, but it was real. Walter realized that by trying to line up loyalty with fairness, he'd stepped out of the role they'd grown used to. He hadn't broken any rules. He hadn't confronted anyone, but he'd stopped being completely predictable, and predictability was what held his unofficial position together. That understanding brought a new kind of tiredness, not the kind that came from carrying too much, but the kind that came from not knowing which version of yourself would keep the balance. If he leaned too hard into loyalty, he felt unjust, to himself and to others. If he leaned into fairness, he risked the standing he'd built over years. Walter began to see that there wouldn't be a clean solution. There was no perfect choice, only choices with different costs. He hadn't reached a breaking point yet. He still believed there was room to adjust, to find a middle ground. But for the first time, he accepted that he might be trying to hold together two things that no longer fit. The plant kept running. The shifts stayed full. Life went on. But inside Walter, something essential had moved. He could no longer act on instinct alone. Every decision now required thought. And thought, he was learning, made loyalty much more expensive. Walter Hayes's dilemma didn't arrive as a single moment. It came as a stretch of days where he could feel the space around him getting smaller. Conversations thinned out. The quiet requests slowed. The supervisor stopped pulling him aside to take a look at things that weren't supposed to turn into paperwork. On the surface, that should have been relief. Walter knew it wasn't. It wasn't rest. It was distance. He saw it in the way decisions started happening without him. Not the big ones, the small ones that used to come with a glance, a nod, an unspoken expectation. Now those looks passed right over him. He hadn't been disciplined, not officially. There was no warning, no note in a file. But the factory had old ways of putting a man back in his place, without saying that's what it was doing. All it had to do was take away informal trust. And without that trust, Walter was left standing in an awkward middle space. A man with a long record of responsibility, but without the access that once let him prevent trouble before it spread. That tension turned real on a Monday morning. A new batch had come in the week before. The volume wasn't unusual, but the deadline was tight. The kind of deadline that made supervisors pace more, inspections move faster, and operators work with a pressure nobody named out loud. Walter noticed early that one section was being pushed past what felt right. Not past official limits, but past the kind of common sense you build over years on the floor. He stood back and watched for a few minutes. The operator was making quick compensations, small adjustments meant to keep pace. The man knew his job. He wasn't careless, but he was being pulled by expectations coming from above. Walter recognized those movements. He'd made them himself, back when everything was still temporary. The difference now was that he understood the cost. He stepped closer and spoke quietly. "Pretty tight over here?" The operator gave a half-smile without humor. "Yeah, but that's what they want." Walter listened to the machine, watched the sequence. "If it keeps running like this, it's going to come back as rework," he said. "Then we lose time anyway." The operator made a small gesture with his hand, like he already knew. "I told the supervisor." He said, "Keep going." That familiar tightening settled in Walter's chest. He went to find the supervisor. Not angry, not confrontational, the same way he'd always gone, trying to stop a bigger problem before it landed. He found him near the line, looking over papers, talking with another supervisor. Walter waited, then said his name, and asked for a minute. They stepped a few feet aside. Walter spoke low. "The way it's running, it's gonna blow back on us. It'll turn into rework." The supervisor didn't look surprised. That alone told Walter plenty. "We need to ship," the man said. "The office is watching this one." Walter nodded. "I get that," he said. "But there's a limit. Push past it, and we lose more time, not less." The supervisor looked at him, his expression flat. "Are you worried about standards?" he asked. "Or about process?" The question sounded simple. It wasn't. Walter understood the trap. Standards were what he'd always stood on. Process was the newer word, the word that made shortcuts acceptable, as long as the numbers moved. "Both," Walter said. The supervisor gave a short nod, ending it. "We'll keep an eye on it." Walter knew what that meant. It meant keep going, and hope the problem didn't show up on their shift. It meant that if it did show up, someone would have to absorb it. And Walter knew who usually absorbed it. He walked back to his station with his head full, not angry, but clear. He was standing between two choices. One was the familiar one. Step in, adjust, smooth things over, save the shift, protect the supervisor, protect the numbers, be loyal to the operation. The other was newer, heavier. Let the paper exist. Make the deviation real. Accept the friction that came with letting the system feel the weight of its own decisions. Walter knew the cost of both. If he absorbed it, the day would likely end quietly, but he would reinforce a logic that was already turning dangerous, the idea that someone would always be there to cushion bad calls. If he logged it, there would be reaction. He'd be seen as someone who sent things upstairs, and he already knew what that did. The distance, the looks passing over him, the trust drying up. Walter stood by his machine, watching parts roll through, listening to metal strike metal. For the first time clearly, he asked himself what he actually owed that place. He owed loyalty, yes. Years of work had fed his family, but he also owed something to his own name, to the way he lived with himself, and those two debts were no longer lining up. Walter didn't want to be a hero. He never had. Heroes belonged in newspapers and speeches. He just wanted to get through life doing what he believed was right, without turning everything into a fight. But now the system had narrowed his options. If he stayed the man who fixed things without paper, he'd be choosing stability at the cost of fairness. If he became the man who let things rise, he'd be choosing fairness at the cost of his standing. The dilemma wasn't about a part or a batch. It was about how much of himself he was willing to trade to keep his place. That afternoon, the problem he'd been expecting finally showed up. A run came out far enough off to require rework. The delay started small, then spread. The supervisor grew tense, talking fast, trying to rearrange the shift. Walter watched and felt something settle inside him. Not anger, but certainty. This was going to keep happening until someone paid for it. The supervisor looked around, by instinct, and his eyes landed on Walter. And in that moment, Walter understood that the choice he'd been circling was no longer theoretical. That look didn't ask for help. It asked him to go back to being the buffer. Walter could step in like he always had. He could patch it, save the day, go home quiet, carrying the familiar weight of having allowed the same logic to repeat itself. Or he could do something that would change how he was seen from that day forward. Let the truth exist on paper, plain and exact. He didn't decide right then, but he understood clearly and without drama that it was no longer a matter of fixing a problem. It was a matter of choosing which cost he was willing to live with. And in a life like his, costs were never paid all at once. They came due over time. Walter Hayes's decision didn't arrive as a clean break from the rest of the day. It blended into the noise of the plant, the smell of oil, the steady rhythm of parts moving down the line. There was no inner speech telling him now, no rush of relief, just a change in how he moved, and that change would follow him for years. After the delay spread through the shift, the supervisor spent the afternoon trying to rearrange schedules. He spoke low and fast, numbers not lining up, time slipping through his hands. The line eventually started moving again, but there was no catching up. Walter watched from a distance. Nobody asked him to step in. Nobody told him not to. The space was there, open, waiting for him to fill it. He felt the familiar pull to act, to adjust things quietly, to smooth the edges. Years of doing it had turned that impulse into muscle memory. One word in the right ear, one small correction, and the day would end without a mark. Walter knew how to do that better than most, but something had shifted. He thought about the past months, how often he'd been leaned on, how responsibility had grown without protection growing with it, how the one time he'd let paper exist, he felt the air change around him. This choice wasn't just about the shift in front of him. It was about the place he was willing to stand in from now on. Walter walked toward the records board. Not quickly, not hesitating, just the way a man walks when he knows he's doing something he's been avoiding for a long time. He took the form. His hands didn't shake. He'd filled out plenty of them before. What made this different was what it meant, not how it felt. He wrote carefully. No extra language, no accusation, just facts, measurements, times, consequences. He didn't protect anyone. He didn't expose anyone either. He filled out exactly what the paper asked for. When he finished, he carried it where it needed to go. He didn't explain himself, didn't ask for a conversation. He handed it in and went back to his station. The reaction didn't come right away. Walter knew that was worse than anger. For the rest of the shift, the floor felt tighter. Voices stayed lower. The supervisor passed by him twice, saying nothing more than a short nod. No criticism, no thanks. Walter finished the day like he always did, cleaned his area, put his tools away, changed out of his coveralls, but the walk to the locker room felt longer. At home, he didn't mention it. He sat down, ate quietly. His wife sensed something had happened, but also sensed it wasn't a night for questions. "You all right?" she asked, just before bed. Walter thought for a moment. "I did what I had to," he said. He didn't add anything else. In the days that followed, the decision started to show its shape. Walter wasn't asked to watch the problem section anymore. He wasn't pulled into quick hallway conversations. Decisions were made farther from him, more often. At the same time, when something went wrong, his name wasn't the first one spoken. That should have felt like relief. Instead, it came with something else. He was becoming less central. Walter kept doing his job well. That never changed. But the in-between space he'd lived in for years The space built on informal trust began to disappear. He was still respected, but he was no longer relied on in the same way. A week later, the supervisor called him in. The conversation wasn't harsh. It wasn't personal. It was procedural. "We need to align expectations," the man said. "Some things have to follow the proper channels." Walter nodded. "That's what I did," he replied. There was a short silence. "It's not always that simple," the supervisor said. Walter didn't argue. He didn't back down, either. "I know," he said. The meeting ended without resolution, the way so many did in that place. From then on, Walter understood he'd been repositioned. Not on paper, but in practice. He was an operator again, nothing more. The extra layer he'd carried for years was gone. Some co-workers kept their distance. Others moved closer, like they saw in him someone who still believed certain lines mattered. Walter wasn't looking for either reaction. What he felt was a strange mix of loss and relief. Loss of a place he hadn't realized he'd built. Relief from carrying something that had grown too heavy. He knew the decision would have consequences. Maybe not dramatic ones, maybe not right away, but real ones. The factory didn't forget men who stopped being useful in the right way. Still, he didn't regret it. Not because he felt morally superior, but because by acting that way, he'd taken back something that had been slipping from him. The ability to recognize himself in his own choices. Walter began to understand that loyalty, without limits, turns into something else, something that looks like duty, but doesn't offer shelter when the cost shows up. He didn't know what came next. He never planned far ahead, but he knew that from that day on, his relationship with the factory had changed. He would keep working. He would keep doing what was expected, but he would no longer carry what the system didn't want to see. The decision hadn't been announced, but it had been made, and in places like that, decisions like his never went unanswered. They just took time to reveal their price. The consequences of Walter Hayes's decision didn't arrive as retaliation. They arrived as absence. In the days that followed, nothing happened that could be pointed to as punishment. Walter kept his job. His pay stayed the same. His name didn't show up on any negative report. If anyone had been asked, every supervisor would have said things were normal, but normal wasn't the same anymore. Walter noticed it first in small ways, in how conversations started and ended around him. Men used to talk through problems out loud, half thinking as they spoke. Now when Walter stepped closer, voices dropped or trailed off, not because they were hiding something, because they didn't want to involve him. There was no hostility in it, there was caution, and caution creates distance. He felt it most in the moments that used to belong to informal exchange. At the start of the shift, when men were still settling into the day. At the end, when fatigue lowered guards and talk got more honest. Now those moments slid past him. Walter kept doing his work well. Nobody questioned that, but he was no longer asked to take a look, no longer pulled into quick decisions. The space he'd occupied, that unnamed middle ground built on informal trust, had closed completely. He was just an operator again. On paper, that should have been relief. In practice, it came with a quiet sense of being set aside. Not discarded, not rejected. Just no longer essential in the way he once had been. Walter felt that clearly one Friday near the end of a shift. A small problem came up in a nearby section. Nothing serious, but enough to cause delays if mishandled. Walter noticed it and waited, maybe without admitting it, for someone to call his name. Nobody did. The problem was handled another way, with more noise, more effort. But it got done. Walter felt a brief tightening in his chest, followed by something harder to name. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't wounded pride. It was the realization that he was no longer needed in that role. That realization followed him home. Over the next few weeks, he noticed changes outside the plant as well. Men he used to linger with after shifts started heading home quicker. Invitations for a beer on the weekend thinned out. Not out of anger, but discomfort. Walter understood. He had become someone who sent things up. even if that wasn't how he saw himself, and in places like that, being seen as a man who might turn a deviation into paper changed the social balance. He didn't resent it, but he felt it. At home, the change showed up differently. Walter still came back at the same hour, but he carried a different kind of quiet with him. Not the silence of physical fatigue, the silence of someone working through something that hadn't found words yet. His wife noticed. "It's quieter over there now," she asked one evening. Walter thought before answering. "It's different." She nodded. She didn't need more. Time began doing its slow, thorough work. Without that informal role, Walter became less visible, not just to problems, but to opportunity. When chances came up to be involved in something new, his name didn't surface the way it once had. Not because anyone decided to exclude him, because he was no longer in the flow. That kind of exclusion is hard to fight. It leaves no trail. Walter understood that fully when a younger operator was asked to shadow a process that months earlier would have been his. There was nothing wrong with the kid. He was capable, interested. Walter even felt a small sense of relief not to be pulled in. But something closed, all the same. He began to see that the loyalty he'd practiced for so long had been recorded in a very specific way, valuable while it absorbed risk. Once it stopped doing that, its value faded. That truth wasn't spoken, but it was lived. Walter didn't lash out. He wasn't built that way, but he began to replay his years at the plant in his head. The unpaid extra hours, the responsibilities accepted without title, the quiet decisions made to protect the whole. He didn't regret any single one of them. Each had made sense at the time. What weighed on him was the larger picture. All that effort hadn't built lasting protection. The factory kept running, maybe even better than before. That hurt in a particular way, not because Walter wanted to be indispensable, but because he'd believed consistency created roots. That loyalty repeated over years turned into something solid. Now he saw that belonging was conditional. It lasted as long as behavior matched what the system needed. Walter started pulling back slightly, not from bitterness but from self-preservation. He spoke less, watched more, did what was required, and no more. Some took that as coldness, others as indifference. No one asked. Isolation, when it arrives this way, rarely sparks conversation. It creates space, and space, given time, becomes habit. Walter noticed that work no longer occupied the same place inside him. It still mattered, but it didn't define everything. He began to spend more time on small things at home he'd always put off, fixing things slowly, reading, sitting without purpose. Those moments didn't erase the loss, but they gave him distance enough to see clearly. He began to accept that a phase of his life was closing, even if nobody had announced it. Not retirement, not departure, but the end of a role. The factory had moved on. Walter would have to do the same, even if he didn't yet know how. He didn't say this out loud. He didn't need to. But inside, he was adjusting to a reality where recognition wouldn't come, and fairness, if it existed, would be private. By that point, time had already done the heavier work. Walter wasn't in open conflict. He wasn't defeated, but he was alone. And in lives like his, it's in that quiet kind of solitude that real consequences take hold, not as punishment, but as the final adjustment between a man and the place he once believed he understood. Time didn't make much noise as it moved through Walter Hayes's life. It simply rearranged things. The months after his decision turned into years without much resistance. Work continued. The whistle still blew. Machines kept running. The town kept waking up early, just like it always had. But inside the plant, Walter began to notice that men aged differently than they did outside of it. On the floor, a man wasn't measured by how long he'd lived, but by how useful he still was. The ones who could solve problems quietly were valued in a particular way. The ones who let things rise even when they were right were seen as risk. And risk was rarely kept near the center for long. Walter wasn't fired. He wasn't pushed out. He wasn't made an example of. He was simply moved out of the way. Supervisors changed. Some left. Others came in with new words and new priorities. Talk of process and flow grew louder. Inspections became more standardized. Old habits faded. The men who'd complained at first eventually stopped. The younger ones learned faster. They didn't know anything else. Walter watched at all of it with the posture of a man who no longer expected to be consulted. He did his work well. That never changed. But the extra layer he once carried, the one that made him part of the plant's inner rhythm, was gone. His days became cleaner, more contained. He came in, worked, and went home. At first that felt like relief. He slept better, thought less about the plant when he wasn't there. His wife noticed he was more present, even when he didn't say much. But over time, another feeling settled in. Walter no longer felt connected to the core of the place. He didn't hear about decisions until after they'd been made. He didn't understand changes until they were already in motion. The work had become mechanical, not from lack of skill, but from lack of belonging. He began to see clearly that belonging wasn't built on years of service. It was built on alignment. And alignment was something he could no longer give without giving up part of himself. There was a stretch when the plant ran into trouble. Nothing big enough to make the papers, but enough to make the office tense. Delays, rework. A few complaints from outside. During that stretch, Walter noticed something that landed quietly but hard. They leaned on other men, not him. At first he told himself it was coincidence. Then he saw the pattern. New buffers had been chosen. Other men were now carrying what he'd once carried. That realization brought a kind of sadness he didn't want to name. Not jealousy, just the confirmation that the system had found another way to balance itself. Nobody was irreplaceable. Walter had always known that in theory. Seeing it in practice was different. At home, life followed its own rhythm. The kids grew. One left the house. Another started working. The town itself began to show small signs of wear. Stores closing earlier, friends talking about jobs elsewhere, rumors of competition coming from outside the region. But it was still the 1950s. There was still work. There was still a sense that the ground, though harder, hadn't given way. Walter, however, no longer saw the factory as an unquestioned shelter. He began to understand that the stability he'd trusted wasn't something you earned once and kept forever. It was a temporary condition, shaped by forces larger than any one man's effort. That understanding made him calmer in some ways, colder in others. He started saving more carefully, avoided large debts, thought twice before buying anything big, not out of fear, but out of caution. His wife noticed. "What are you getting ready for?" she asked once, not accusing. Walter took a moment. "Nothing in particular," he said. "Just trying not to be surprised." She nodded. She knew the kind of man she'd married. At the plant, Walter was still respected as a good worker. No one denied that, but respect and influence weren't the same thing. He was seen as reliable, but no longer essential. From time to time, he heard simplified versions of his own story. Hayes likes paperwork. He complicates things, not said with malice. Just labels that made sense to people who hadn't lived the details. Walter didn't argue. He didn't explain. Explaining always felt too close to asking for understanding, and he'd never been comfortable with that. He let time do what it always does, smooth things down, flatten them into easier shapes. Some nights, he found himself thinking back to the days when he occupied that unnamed middle space, when he was needed, consulted, trusted in ways that weren't written down. He tried to remember whether that had truly been a good place, or just a comfortable kind of trap. He couldn't answer that cleanly. What he knew was that the cost had been real, not a financial cost, an internal one. Loyalty had asked more of him than he'd realized at the time, and no one could refund that. At the same time, choosing to step back, choosing fairness over absorption, had brought its own cost. Distance, isolation, a quieter place in the world. Walter began to accept that the balance would never return to what it had been, that adulthood, sometimes, didn't offer a way back, only a way to settle into what came next. He kept working. He kept getting up early. He kept doing what he knew how to do, but inside, he no longer believed the system was fair in the way he'd once been taught. It wasn't fair. It was functional, and those were different things. That difference began preparing him for what was still ahead, not as a shock, but as confirmation. Walter didn't know that yet, of course. No one knows when they're living through the years that will eventually explain the end of a story. He just kept going, and somewhere between one winter and the next, between one shift and another, Walter came to understand that the price of loyalty was rarely collected all at once. It was taken in installments, small ones, quiet ones, and by the time a man noticed, most of the bill had already been paid. The revelation didn't come with sirens. There were no investigators, no men in suits knocking on doors, no speeches, no reckoning. It came the way real things often do in lives like Walter Hayes's, by accident, on an ordinary afternoon, mixed in with news that didn't seem to have anything to do with him. It was in the newspaper. Walter didn't read the paper out of habit or curiosity. He read it to stay oriented. Prices, nearby towns, a wreck on the highway, an ad for work. Reading it was a way of checking the shape of the world. On a rare day off, he picked up yesterday's paper, already creased and worn, and sat at the kitchen table. The house was quiet. His wife was out running errands. The radio was off. Outside, the neighborhood had that slow, weekday calm. Cars passing now and then. He flipped through without much interest. Politics, sports, advertisements. He read halfway, turned pages, not looking for anything. Then he saw a small article, tucked low on the page, not big enough to catch the eye of anyone chasing drama. It talked about a problem in a project, something involving steel structures, reinforcements, material reviews. It didn't say collapse. It didn't say failure. The language was careful, technical, written to sound responsible without causing alarm. Walter read it once, then he read it again. At first he wasn't sure why it caught him. Not because it was hard to understand, but because it sounded familiar in a way that didn't make sense right away. Like hearing a voice you recognize without seeing the face. The article said that certain parts from an older batch, supplied years earlier, had shown performance below expectations in recent tests. There would be preventive reinforcement. There would be a review of old documentation. The standards, it said, were within tolerance at the time. That word was there, tolerance. Walter went very still. He wasn't reading as a citizen anymore. He was reading as a man who knew factory floors, who knew how numbers could be used to say acceptable when the feeling on the ground said otherwise. The article named the company quietly, not as blame, just as reference. One name among many, like a footnote to history. Walter stared at the print for a long moment. He tried to do what he'd always done when something touched a nerve, organize his thoughts, separate feeling from fact. But this wasn't emotion. It was memory. He remembered the years when he'd been the one called to absorb problems, the day he finally let a deviation exist on paper and felt the silence close in around him. The look from the supervisor that always meant handle it, without saying the words. Walter didn't know, and would never know for sure, whether that article was directly connected to the specific situation that had forced his choice. It could have been another department, another line, another chain of decisions. Industry was big. Causes overlap, but he recognized the language. Within tolerance. Standards at the time. Preventive review. It was the same way of addressing a problem without admitting it had ever truly been one. Walter folded the paper slowly and set it on the table. He sat there with his hands resting on the wood, staring at a spot that wasn't anything in particular. He understood, with a clarity that hurt because of how simple it was, that this was as much confirmation as life usually offers. Not justice, not vindication, not someone saying, "You were right." Just a piece of paper saying that, somewhere down the line, a cost had shown up. Not with blood, not with spectacle, with expense. Walter felt a brief urge to show the article to his wife when she got home, not to say "I told you so," but to share the weight. The urge passed, almost as soon as it came. What would it change? She knew him, she knew the kind of man he was. And that kind of confirmation didn't undo the years he'd carried responsibility without protection. It didn't erase the isolation that followed. Some truths, Walter realized, are only good for settling things inside a man. He folded the paper and put it away, not in a special place, not like evidence, just tucked in with other old papers he kept out of habit, expired warranties, receipts, instruction manuals for tools he no longer owned, things that weren't useful anymore, but felt wrong to throw away. That night, when his wife came home, Walter didn't mention the article. They ate dinner, talked about small things, and the evening passed the way evenings always did. But inside, something had settled. Not bitterness, not triumph, resolution. Walter saw clearly now that he'd spent years trying to keep his loyalty clean, believing the world repaid steadiness in proportion. Now he understood that the industrial world didn't work that way. It rewarded what was convenient in the moment, and forgot the rest just as easily. What stayed was what a man could live with. Walter hadn't been perfect. He knew that. He'd made compromises. He'd held things that maybe should have gone on paper sooner. He'd been part of the system as long as he believed it was the price of stability. But he also knew this. When the line became clear, he chose a limit. That limit had cost him, but it was his. The newspaper didn't give him pride. It gave him something rarer, coherence. Walter understood that in the end, that was what he would have. No one would write about him. No one would ask for his account. The world would go on without knowing the name of the man who, at one moment, decided not to be the buffer. But he would know, and over time, that knowledge began to feel like enough. Walter Hayes kept working for a few more years. Nothing special marked that stretch of time. There was no late promotion, no dramatic ending, no final argument. He simply kept showing up, working his shifts, doing what he knew how to do. The routine that once felt like a solid agreement became just that, routine. Strangely enough, that brought a kind of peace. Walter no longer expected recognition. He didn't wait for fairness to show up dressed as reward. He had learned, quietly and for good, that some places don't return loyalty. They just make use of it while it fits their needs. That understanding didn't make him bitter. It made him exact. He became more careful about where he put extra effort. He stopped feeling responsible for every loose thread. He learned to treat his own limits as something real, something legitimate, not a weakness. The factory changed slowly. New machines came in. Some sections were reorganized. Men he'd worked beside for decades, retired or left without much notice. Younger men stepped into those spaces with the ease of people who never knew how it used to be. Walter watched it, all the way you watch a river keep moving, after the spot where you used to stand has washed away. He didn't feel part of the center anymore, but he didn't feel wounded by it either. At home, life found a different rhythm. Less hurry, more quiet. Small habits he'd always postponed began to fill the days. Tending the yard, fixing things without rushing, reading without a goal. His wife noticed. "You seem lighter," she said once. Walter thought about it. "I know where I stand now," he said. She smiled. She didn't ask more. The years taught Walter that some choices only show their real weight long after they're made. When the noise fades, when the versions settle, when no one is watching anymore. He understood that he would never have public confirmation of what he'd done. No one would tell him he'd been right. There would be no apology, no formal acknowledgement, no clearing of the record, and he no longer needed any of that. What mattered was that when he looked back on those difficult days, the dilemma, the form filled out, the silence that followed, he could recognize himself there, not as a hero, not as a victim, just as a man who, at a certain point in his life, chose not to cross a line. Walter learned that honor isn't something you announce. It's something you carry, and that carrying it often costs more than seems reasonable. But he also learned something else. Living without that limit costs more still. When he finally left the factory, there was no speech, a handshake, a few polite words, a simple watch given as a token. Walter thanked them, slipped it into his pocket, and walked out through the gate one last time. The building stayed. The whistle kept blowing. Other men took the same places. Life went on. Years later, already older, Walter would sometimes drive past the old plant. He never stopped, never felt the need to. He'd glance over, recognize the shape of it, and keep going. He didn't feel nostalgia for the place. He felt respect for the man he'd been there. Walter understood with the calm clarity that only time gives, that not all loyalty is worth the price it demands, and that choosing where not to be loyal is sometimes the most honest way to stay whole. He never told this story to many people, not because he was ashamed, but because he knew it didn't need explaining. Some stories aren't meant to teach. They're just meant to be true. And for Walter Hayes, that was enough.